Hey everybody, what's up? It's Booksy here. So today I'm going to do an update on ATER. It is very late on a Sunday night, December 19th. Obviously, not as bunch of people are going to watch this before market open on December 20th. But basically, what I want to do is just talk about what went out, what went down on Friday, and why it's important, and also just kind of talk about um, my expectations for the week and for the next month going into January, really. So on Friday, we saw it break back above what I would call the main wedge channel here, and so we did get our breakdown and then follow through. And it did what was expected, but it took a lot longer than I expected. And that is that it did go below the wedge and then retest the top of the wedge. And then it seemed to suggest that it was going to continue upward. At this point in the day, I definitely was, and even before then, had noticed that it was emulating the macro fractal. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So, first of all, if you're looking at these charts, you might almost confuse them. They look very, very similar. The reason for that is this right here. You can consider it like a spring because that's exactly what it is. And then this is a test of that region. So if you are familiar with Wyckoff accumulations, then this should look pretty familiar to you, where you have a primary sell-off, right? Automatic retest. And then we actually have, in this case, you could call this support in phase B, but essentially what you've got here is it goes into a spring very quickly. And it does test it, and then it goes into, so this is all one accumulation down here. And then over here, it goes into a distribution, and then it comes back. And if you look at it as a macro, then basically what you've got here is you've got a macro test. Okay. And if you want to look at it, from this point of view, also as a quick accumulation, you can. We're not going to go into like too much detail about that right now. But I wanted to point out the similarities in the chart. So this is a breakdown and a breakout pattern. And, a lot of people are just going to look at this and say, well, it's kind of a double bottom. It's got a W shape. It looks like it's ready to sort of retest and start making higher highs on like a more macro level. Now, if you notice, do you see this little double tap here? All right, it actually is the same that we're seeing when you zoom out. So this is August, September, October, November, December, right? And this is just the last few days. And you see this double tap here, these larger double tap that happened on December 3rd and then December 15th. Very, very much the same as the double tap that occurs here. And you might be saying, well, I see that, but I also see that this isn't like super easy to understand, right? You kind of get lost. You can see that right here, see that W shape? Here's that W shape. And then look at the macro W shape, W shape. Okay. So there's actually happening in more than one time frame. And I know there's one here as well, but specifically this, okay? It is this right here, right? But then this particular part of the fractal mimics this part of the fractal. And if I draw you're probably all like, what the heck is going on? If I draw a wedge here, maybe it'll look more obvious to you. Okay, so this is the macro, right? And this is the micro. What the micro is telling us is that this is the next expected move on the macro, because this is the way that the stock is being traded. And we've already talked about the macro fractal. I did a video on it not that long ago. I found it in here. And the next step was a markup, which makes sense. Okay. So if you look at it in these time frames, you can see that after this double bounce here, right, there's like a retest. So let's use the micro fractal to inform the macro fractal. So there's a retest just below. That's what happened on December 15th. So this little period right here is actually what's going on over here, right? And then you get a push up. This is not super clear as to like what exactly is being tested here. All right, so this might be a little bit confusing. But basically we have a push up, probably 382 retrace or something, and then another push up. Now you might be looking at this saying, well, it's sold off, right? I wouldn't take this like too far, okay, because this is really tiny. This has all happened in like a day. And microfractals can be very, very misleading based on just the tiniest of time frames. So if you look at it this way, you would expect to see a push up almost halfway through this wedge, right? And then some kind of a sell off. And that's what we get. See that? Push up, push down. See that? Push up, push down. All right. So this is on the macro. All right. Push up, push down. And then the next move is what? It's up again. All right. And then it sort of peaks off, perhaps up here. All right. Something like that. See how that matches? Roughly, it's not exactly the same. And these levels, by the way, they could be slightly off. We could see this play out a lot lower. So don't look at this and say, oh, Booksy says it's going to go here by January 20th. Like, it could be much lower, or it could even be much, much higher. And this also could be very compressed. So this price action right here took a day. Here, it could take a week. All right, we don't know exactly until we start seeing the volume pick up, which hasn't happened yet. But my point here is that this fractal actually tracks really well on every time frame. So you see this push up, down, up, down, up. So we got up, down, down again. See, that creates like a double bottom. So we would expect, let's say hypothetically, if this came back down to 670 something, that it would come back down there again, and then it would go again, potentially. We're going to see what happens this week, but my guess is that it's going to run. If it did continue down, all right, then we take it with a grain of salt, because this is a microfractal, and until we see it play out, you can't make a definite call. Now, what's interesting here, very interesting here, is that if you zoom out just a little bit more, let's say the 3-minute, you actually see it again once my chart loads. So this right here played out on the 1 minute over the course of 2 days. Okay. Now look at this one. Here it is again. And this one, you're starting to see what I'm going at here. This looks a lot like something we've seen before, which is this, again, this macro fractal. Okay, we have this big sell-off, and there's this large dip, comes up, right? Makes a higher high here on this test, and then it pushes up. So let's use this one now, and let's see if we can get a sort of a measurement or an idea of what might look like. So again, it comes down, right? And in this case, we're going to look at it again from this point of view. That should look familiar, right? Look at that. It's the same fractal. Now what happens here? Well, in this case, this doesn't give us a whole lot of information because we didn't actually see it play out here. But let's say we took this fractal, and in this case, I am going to do a bars pattern. A bars pattern isn't really a fractal per se, because a fractal is a sequence. So a bars pattern can be kind of messed up, right? But let's just say that this right here occurs just like it did here on the tiny one, but on a slightly larger time frame. Okay. What would that look like? Well, we started with that dip, right? Back down to touch the level. That's this right here. That's already occurred. That's the dip. What's the next move? Well, I guess potentially the next move is just more of an upward move. Okay, so without going into too much speculation, this does appear to come up to perhaps, I don't know, this top one of these markers right here. Could be this one, it could be this one. It's hard to say on the micro, but let's just say about 3/4 of the way. And this actually looks pretty convincing to me just because there's 2 touch points here. So maybe about halfway, it's a little bit more. And this is where this is where it experiences its first bounce. All right. And then look, we actually get, on top of the trading range, we break down. Okay. And if you kind of notice here, this is starting to play out in a pretty interesting way. You see how on the micro, when it came back down, where did it touch? Touch the top of that little region, right? The bounce region. But it was higher up in the fractal. So this is not exactly one-to-one at all. And you can see this is the region that actually would correlate to this region. So if you're not confused yet, it's okay if you are confused. We don't need to make this like predictive just yet. My point is that this move, okay, it hasn't happened yet on this particular level. But if it did happen, maybe it would go up to this region, kind of come back down and swoop up. All right. All right. So let's go back to maybe like the 5 minute. And let's take a look. Did it happen again? Okay. No, it did not. Because at this point, we're no longer experiencing that same move. But what we want to see happen, basically, is how this might play out on the larger time frame. So there is this move, all right? And I'll give you that. That move exists. But then let's take a look at the even larger time frame. Let's go to the 2 hour. Check this out. And there's our move again. This time it's on a 2 hour time frame. This is the way that the stock is being traded. It's being traded this way on the macro. Right? It's the pattern that they're using to trade it for accumulation, and distribution, and on the micro for accumulation and distribution. So you see this flat level right here correlate to this region, push up right into a distribution, happened very fast up here. This one's a little more drawn out, and then we get a sell. We get a first major sell test right here. All right, go down a little further, and then we get the major one, right? And at this point, it's important to note that if you follow me on Twitter, I posted about how $4.20 was the level that I was looking at for a test here. And the reason that I knew that was because I looked at where did it find support. And in this case, it's these little shoulders. So I marked the shoulders, and I was like, oh, it's $4.20. And I'm not going to pull up the tweet or pull up like a picture. I mean, you don't believe me, that's fine. But I posted it on our Discord, and I said, yeah, it's going to hit 420. And it was right around here. So it's like 2 days in advance. I said, I think it's going to hit 420 because that's the level that this thing will bounce at. And it did it on the macro, so I think it's going to do it on the micro. So it was a good call. And if you notice, that correlation here is very one-to-one in regards to how it sort of respects these levels. So what I want to do now is I want to say, okay, let's say that we understand the way it's possibly going to move on this smaller time frame. This is still a double bounce, right? We got that figured out, right? But then let's look at it from this point of view, right? And see if we can, again, sort of determine how it might iterate. So we couldn't do it here because, again, it didn't finish. Remember, we talked about it just a minute ago. Showed you the fractal that was right here. And it's like, it's not done yet. So let's go back to the smaller one. And this is kind of, again, you have to be a little bit careful. This is a little bit speculative because small time frames are not as consistent, right, as larger time frames, especially with these micro fractals. So let's get rid of this. Well, let's just take a look at how this played out, okay? So in this case, on the micro, it's kind of hard to tell. I think that you could probably argue this region over here is this region right here, okay? And, oops, I didn't mean to do that. All right, so we get the dip. This is the flattening. It's very fast. Distribution, you can see there's almost like 1, 2, 3, 4 happens each way at the same time. All right, this right here doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I guess you could say that this is the spring that occurs right here, but then beyond that, it doesn't seem to have much of a comparison. If we draw like a simple line, just to see, yeah, it's not really very clear. I suppose you could say that this is the first dip, the flattening, the second dip, and then this right here represents the knockdown. All right, and the push up, and where is it going? It's going back to the top of this trading range. And we talked about this on the fractal just above this. It was heading back towards the top of the trading range. So let's say this occurs right on the macro. And we have that W here. Could that be this entire arc, right? Don't think about it like this, because remember, we're on a larger time frame. So if you were to look at this on, let's say, like a weekly or a daily, you may not see some of these moves. You'll just see larger candles. So does that account for an up and then a down? Yes, it does. So the W that we talked about here just a minute ago would account for an up and then a down. All right. And then pushing further, let's say this is the top of this particular trading range. All right. Then the expectation could be that, yeah, we're going to head back at some point towards the top of this trading range, which is, again, is like $50. So I'm telling you right now that even though I'm not playing the options on it, I'm definitely accumulating down here because we're at really low amount. And if this thing runs to $50, it's absurdly high, right? And that's normal for a stock that's undergoing accumulation. Okay, to come back to the distribution zone and to consider a markup. Now, if it's, I'm sorry, I meant accumulation. I don't know if I said distribution, but now that being said, this right here is not a sign of weakness. This is a sign of strength, that we got a higher high, that we're making higher highs, okay? And even if it were to dip one more time, all right, for some reason, which I don't think the fractals support that, but even if it did, we still have this major trend line. So unless that broke and you got like an actual sign of weakness, there's no reason at all, given the OBV on balance volume of this thing skyrocketing, there's no reason at all to think this is a bearish play. I just do not see that thesis at all, except for this. People just saying, oh, it's in a downtrend. Well, okay, who cares? Like, every stock is in a trend until it changes direction. The point of technical analysis is to analyze where that change of direction is happening. And I believe it's happening right now. When this thing pushes up and we get to 50, that's when we get our SOS phase. Okay, so it's going to be slow. You're going to get like a last point of support, perhaps down here or up here at this region, this $20 region. Kind of the peak over here. On the short term fractal, right, you also have something very similar. Okay. And in this case, this could be considered like the spring and the test. And you might be saying, well, I don't see how that's possible, Booksy. Well, if you look at, again, just on a slight angle, all right, and you chart the bottom here, right, you can see that this dipped below, okay, this trend line. And even if you didn't think that was a spring, you don't have to have a spring in order to have a Wyckoff accumulation, okay? Just because this thing doesn't look exactly like a schematic does not mean it's not an accumulation schematic. So I expect some kind of an SOS to occur in every one of these regions. And I'm just going to leave you with that today. Nothing really strongly predictive for this week, because this week is going to be a bit of a toss-up. But I will say that you're going to have some kind of an SOS in this region. might be a little loose on the minute chart, right? You're going to have some kind of an SOS in this region. So let's say we get up there, maybe the SOS, that W, maybe that is the SOS. Maybe it occurs higher, okay? Or it occurs after that W that we saw earlier, all right? And then when it gets up here, then it, gives you the SOS. It's going to be in this region. You can just tell, all right? And this is the first trading region. So we're looking at multiple time frames, right? In this region, you're going to have an SOS around $4.70. In this region, you're going to have an SOS around, it's a pretty big area, between 520 and 575. And once this starts playing out, we're going to get a better idea of how it might move on the macro. Because this right here, this fractal is, to me, is like a really close representation of the macro. It's very chartable. So it's going to give us a really good indication of how it might move on a might. I say might because you never know. You don't know what the market's going to do every single day. The point is that this could be a predictive indicator, all right? Because it's how the stock is being traded. And so far, I've not been wildly wrong about this, all right? Everything's sort of tying together and panning out. So that's where I'm going until, that door closes. So then you would expect to see, so you're going to have SOS at 475 area, 550 area, then a larger SOS at 1475, and then finally, okay, on the macro, right, you see how this, again, models the macro. You're going to have a macro SOS at probably this very top of the trading range here. You see how back here it respected this area? That's where it would occur. Okay, so that would be between $37 and $47. Now, keep in mind that during an SOS, you can have a buy up, last point of support, and sometimes it means it takes you back to the previous, so it could drop here and come all the way back to like $20 after consolidating as like almost like a last spring, okay? Because if this is the previous region, then it's going to retest it, all right, and then it goes. That's pretty normal, all right, for accumulation schematics. So this isn't saying it's just going to go boom, 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 boom up to these regions and just barcode and go up, barcode and go up. I don't think it's going to be quite like that, although when this thing has run in the past, it's been pretty darn quick and decisive about it, right, after having an SOS, okay? So, a sign of strength. Now, what would happen after this SOS? Well, I've already talked about this before, but you've got some pretty modest trend lines and you've got some really crazy trend lines. But yes, I do fully believe that this thing could go for a significant markup, certainly beyond anywhere in this region, 80 to 200. I mean, it's kind of crazy. It depends on how quickly it gets there, right? If it goes faster, then you're looking at a lower amount. If it takes a little longer, it could actually be a much higher amount based on just purely like the trend lines and how they'll trade it. And yes, they would definitely, it's very possible that they then go into a distribution. Does the distribution have to take you back ever to these levels? Well, no. I mean, if you were to continue this line, a distribution way down the line could come down to like, I don't know, $11, right? Maybe this region becomes the new low. Okay, and so the markup is what we're talking about. It's raising the price of the stock and then trading it in a higher range, right? But it doesn't mean that it goes up indefinitely. It could also be, though, that this establishes some new trend line, and that trend line is respected even higher. And those are all bullish scenarios. Bearish scenarios, it's just the opposite, right? I mean, it's like maybe you come up here and you don't break out. And at that point, this doesn't look very good. And it's, it breaks beneath this support or something, okay? That would be very bearish in my opinion. And at that point, that'd be a very different kind of scenario, all right? But that hasn't happened. So anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. I will look forward to talking to you guys later. I'm probably not going to be posting very much this week on any stocks, but certainly after the holiday, I will come back and give you updates in a timely manner. So have a good one.